We're learning the second Sikha on Parshas Vayikra in Chelek Chav Zayin on page 8. The shir today is being learned to Lenishmas Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Rabbi Menashe Koltman. In Saif Hilchis Yisura Mizbeach, in the end of the halachas that speak about those things that are forbidden to be brought as a carbon on the Mizbeach, Nachtam vid Rambam rechentais di Minei Shmanim vazen ksherim lemeneira. After the Rambam counts the various different qualities of oil that are fit to be used to light the menorah, viertais, and then the Rambam concludes aval menachos kulan ksherim, for the carbon mincha, which is the flour offering that's brought in the Beis Hamikdash, any quality of the oils is okay. And the Rambam actually counts 9 different qualities of oil. Is the Rambam mamshech b'halacha b'fnei atzmei. The Rambam continues and concludes in a separate halacha. If all of these oils are fit to be used for the carbon mincha, so lama nimnu, why are all these qualities of oil counted here? And the answer is in order to let us know what is the best quality oil, what's an average quality, and the inferior quality, because one that wants to bring a merit to himself or to refine himself, let him subdue his Yetzer Hara. V'yarchiv yodai, and let him be generous, and v'yavi karbonai min hayafe hameshubach b'yesa shebaisai min sheyavim mimenu. And you should bring a sacrifice from the best quality that there is of that kind. Harinema b'teira, it says in the Teira, v'hevel hevi gamhu mi'b'chayres tzaynai u'b'chalbeyan. When Hevel brought a carbon, he brought from the best of his sheep and from the fattest as the carbon. And Vayisha Hashem el Hevel v'mulchasai. And Hashem turned to Hevel and to the carbon that he brought. V'hu adin, similar is also to be said, B'chol davar shu l'shem hakel latoiv shiyeh min hanoah v'atoiv. Anything that one does for the sake of the name of Hashem, that he should bring it from the most beautiful and the best quality. And the Rambam gives the following examples. In Banat based tefillah, if he builds a shul, it should be more beautiful than the home that he lives in. Hechel rav, he's giving it to eat to those that are hungry. Yachel min hatoiv v'hamaslik sheb'shulchanai. He should give them to eat from the best and the sweetest that he has on his table. Kisa aram, he's giving clothing to one that needs clothing. Yechase min hayafish sheb'ksusa. He should use the most beautiful clothing that he has. Hikdish davar, if he is makdish, he sanctifies anything to be hektish for Hashem. Yakdish min hayafesh sheb'nechasav, he should give from the best qualities that he has in his possession. V'cheinu aimer, this is also the meaning that the pasuk says, v'chol chaylev or kol chaylev l'Hashem, that the fattest, the best quality should be donated to Hashem, the gaimer. So this is the conclusion of Hilchis Yisurei Mizbeach. Darfen verstehen. So what we need to understand about this halacha is as follows. Dem din, as we bringen min mufcher, this halacha that one should bring from the choicest, from the best, for a carbon, hashen the Rambam gesagt frier in Tchilas HaPerek. The Rambam says this in the beginning of this Perek, the 7th Perek of Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach. And there the Rambam writes, Kloi kol davar she'ein apostle mevi oisel lechatchila cholo. Not anything that is not puzzle, which is not disqualified, can be lechatchila brought as a carbon. Whatever is being brought as a carbon should be brought from the best. Und das lernt man ab vom Pasuk, and this is learned from what it says in the Pasuk, with the Rambam hat schon gebracht in the halachas frier, as the Rambam already brought this earlier on in these halachas. Mivchar nederecha or nedrechem, from the best. When you make a neder to bring a carbon, you should bring from your best. Now, the question then is, if the Rambam already explained this point before, so what is the new halacha that the Rambam is adding and saying here? Welche Aleph werd abgelernt, davon was nimnu die Darges im Minim und Shmanim. A new idea that the Rambam is learning from this, that Chazal count for us the 9 different qualities that there is in oil. Beis is verbunden mit Ratzen Adam haroitze lezakis atzmai, and here the Rambam says that this is something that is totally up to the choice and the desire of the person, one that wants to be mezake himself, not like what the Rambam said before, that this is what should be done with some, that you should bring the carbon min hamufcher. Und Gimel bringt of them noch rayas. The Rambam here brings additional proofs for this. He brings the proof from the carbon of Hevel. On the pasuk of Kol Chelev Hashem V'Gomer. So why these new details here, if the Rambam already made this point before and learned it out from the pasuk of Mivchar Nidrechem? So now the answer simply is as follows: But Pashtus can lernen as in the minyan from Mina Mufcher by Karbonis Zenefaran Kamedargis. When it comes to this concept of bringing a carbon from the best quality, there are different levels to this. This is mashma in Rambam Gufa, as this seems to be the case from the words of the Rambam himself. And the Rebbe goes on to tell us what these different levels are. In carbon. There is the most basic level of being mufcher, being a good quality for a carbon that is required. It's not a choice, it's not lechatchila, but it's a must. On them is this asal mizbeach. Without having this quality, at least, it's forbidden to be brought on the mizbeach. And we're not talking about something that has a blemish. That's a different problem. When there's an actual blemish, it may not be brought. But even without a blemish, there are certain things that must be in the quality of the animal brought. Al derech, with the Rambam sagt in Perik Beis, similar to what the Rambam says in the second Perik here in Hilchos Yisurim Mizbeach, Arba Chayloyim Acherim, and he counts there certain 4 of other illnesses that there are in animals. And as examples, the Rebbe brings Misha B'Loiven Eina Yabeles Sheim B'Seir. In the white of the eye of the animal, there is a growth. Or Im Nigmu Mukarnav Chulu, the horns are not in good quality. Im Nimtza Echel Men B'Beheime, if an animal has any of these issues, Ein Akriva Noisa Lefonav, Ein Akriva Noisa, that is, it cannot be brought as a carbon. Lefi She'ena Min HaMufchar, because it's not considered to be from the best. And the carbon has to be brought from the best. When one makes a neder, it should be brought from the best, and this is an animal with an illness, and it's not for the best. It doesn't qualify. That's one level. This is a basic level of being a good quality, which is an obligation. A level up, even more than this, is da sug mufcher, was is nit blois scheidela beheme shenimtza ba eine von die chaylayim v'chayetze bezeh. We're not only talking about an animal that does not have one of these illnesses. If it has these illnesses, then it's forbidden to be brought on the mizbeach. Rather, even and primarily, we're focusing now on another level, which is a lamb that's weak and not in good shape. It's not beautiful and good quality. So even if this level of being good quality is lacking, meaning it's not an animal with any illness or anything that the Rambam speaks about in Perik Beis, but it's still not a good, nice quality animal, it should not be brought as a carbon. The Rambam sagt in Reish Perik Zayin, and this is what was quoted before, what the Rambam says here in the beginning of this Perik, in Perik Zayin, not anything that's not possible means that it's good enough to be brought lechatchila as a carbon. If one is obligated to bring a carbon, you shouldn't bring a lamb which is in bad shape, in bad quality, and say, the carbon I'm bringing has no blemish. Regarding one that brings a carbon this way, the pasuk says that one that brings the carbon in this way is cursed. Ella rather, kol sheyavi lekarbon yavi min hamufcher. When you bring a carbon, it should be from the choicest and best quality. That's the second level of min hamufcher. Move on from divrei Rambam behilchis ma'isa karbonis. This level of bringing from the best is also understood from what the Rambam says in a different place, in Ma'isa Karbonis. And there he writes, one that makes a vow to bring an ox, a ram, or a lamb, or a calf, or anything similar. Don't bring one that is very weak and bad quality. From that species. He's not obligated to bring from the very best that there is in this species. He can bring from what's average. If he does bring from a lesser and weak quality, he has fulfilled his vow. The Rambam is speaking about one that made a neder to bring a carbon. Und der Rambam bringt dort ein Klalnit, as man soll bringen a Yafeh v'shomeh mitzad Mivchar Nedrechem. And he doesn't bring this pasuk of Mivchar Nedrechem that is quoted regarding those that should not be brought if they have an illness. This is another level of bringing from the best when it's an animal that has no illness, but it shouldn't be an animal that's weak and not good quality. It should be at least average. Now, we come to the halacha that we began with here at the end of Hilchos Isurim Mizbeach. Besoif Hilchos Isurim Mizbeach is the Rambam Mechadish. Here the Rambam tells us something new and adds, as haroitze lezakis atzmoi yochav yitzroi hara v'yarchiv yodoi v'yavi karbonoi min hayafe hameshubach b'yoser. So here the Rambam says that one that wants to be meritorious and wants to subdue his Yetzer Hara should bring from the very best, from the best quality that he has. Nid blois azavas is nid kochesh v'kar, which means not only a quality that's not weak, a beinani, average, vafilu l'mayla mi beinani, or even better than average, nor hayafe hameshubach b'yoser, the very best and choicest quality. That's what the Rambam is talking about in this halacha, so it's not a repetition from what he already mentioned before. Und das lernt der Rambam up, nit von mivchan nedrechem. This halacha, the Rambam learns not from the words mivchan nedrechem, which is the source for the most basic level of bringing a good quality, nor the fun was nimnu di mine ashmanim. Rather, he learns it out from this that Chazal count the different qualities of oil, bringt them, and he additionally brings a proof from vehevel hevi gamu mebechayres tzaynim mebechalbeyen, that he brought from his very best of his sheep, on kol chaylev l'Hashem, and from the pasuk where it says that the fattest and the best is to be brought for Hashem. And from them dafka learned panop that from here we learn out that v'hu adin b'chol davashul l'Shem akel atayv shiyeh min hanoah v'atayv, that the same applies to anything that one dedicates for the name of Hashem, that it should be from the nicest and the best. Mashenkin der din from mivchan nedrechem is adin miyuchad by karbonis. On the other hand, though, what we learn from the pasuk mivchan nedrechem regarding the quality of the animal that's to be brought on a more basic level, that's a unique din by karbonis. But this halacha here about bringing the very best, that applies not only by karbonis, but as the Rambam brings other examples also that one is dedicating to Hashem, it applies as well. Azay zeich muchach von hemshech loshen Rambam do. This idea that here the Rambam is telling us something new about the very best quality that one should dedicate, it's clear also from what we see as the Rambam explains this here. And again, what the Rambam is basing all this on is, if all oils are good to be used for the karban mincha, why do Chazal count 9 different levels of quality of oil? That's what the Rambam is explaining here. Seemingly, this is not understood. The Rambam hat doch schon gesagt in a friedige halacha. The Rambam already explained before, in a halacha before, about the qualities of the oil, that afa pisha kulang she'ena lemenachos, although they all qualify to be brought for the karban mincha, harishain ein lemayla mimenu, the first oil that he speaks about, which is the oil that's crushed, and from the best oil from the top of the tree, that's the best quality, then v'achar v'sheni chulu, then comes the second quality. As the Rambam there explained the different levels of the oil. Is memela move on the tam lomenimnu. So isn't it already understood from there why Chazal are telling us about the qualities of these oil to understand what's the best and what comes next? Dem din von mivchan nedrechem hat doch schon der Rambam gebracht frier. The Rambam already brought this idea that one should bring from the best for his carbon. Darf man doch wissen, die Darges und die Schmannen, kedei ze keine mekayim sein, der min amufcha. So then it's self-understood why the Rambam is telling us about the different qualities of oil in order to know what is the best quality to fulfill that that pasuk of mivchan nedrechem to bring from the best. So why is the Rambam addressing this question again here? Is the fun gufe gedrungen? So from this itself it's clear as mitzad and chiyuv from min hamufchar, that based just on the obligation of min hamufchar that was already mentioned before, that one has to bring from the best, is nit muchrach wissen die darges. It's not necessary to know all these levels of quality of the oil. Weil min hamufchar is shein blois, is shailul blois kochush v'chor. When we say that it must be brought from the best and choicest quality, that just means that it should not be brought from the worst, and or from an animal, or for something that is, by the case of an animal with an illness, or the other level when you have something which is weak and not below average quality. Aber es ist nicht ein Chiyuv zu bringen, der Meshubach b'yoser, that it doesn't mean that there should be an obligation to bring from the very best. Und der Far sagt der Rambam lo menimno, and therefore the Rambam here says, why are all these qualities of oil being counted, including all the levels of oil from the first to the last, when it's not relevant to know what these qualities are? It would be just enough to say what is considered to be average, what's the basic good quality of oil. That here, the explanation of why all these oils are being counted is because this is specifically for one that wants to bring the best quality for one that's on this level, the one that wants to purify himself. That's the simple understanding of the various different levels of mina mufchar when it comes to bring the best for a carbon. And here in the last halacha, the Rambam concludes with the very best that one wants to bring as a carbon. And therefore, however, it still remains to be understood regarding this halacha here. As der din in Rambam is nit verbunden dafke mit karbonis. Since, as explained, this halacha here in the Rambam is not connected specifically to karbonis. Nit wie der din von mivchan et rechem was is dafke by karbonis kanal. Unlike the halacha of the more basic level of bringing from the best, which is only regarding karbonis, but this halacha, as the Rambam brings other examples, is not only by karbonis. It's a general din connected to anything that's for the sake of Hashem. Anything that's for the sake of Hashem. As the Rambam brings the examples. Is favas sagt es der Rambam erst da in Hilchos Yisurim Mizbeach. So why does the Rambam wait until here in Hilchos Yisurim Mizbeach to bring this point? Und sagt es nicht früher in Hilchos Matnas Aniyim. Why doesn't he bring up this point earlier in the halachas of Matnas Aniyim, where he talks about those gifts that have to be given to the poor? Behesem lahadugme da gufe, and that's with the example that the Rambam here brings, that hechel rav chulu kisa aram chulu, that when you give to eat or give clothing for the poor, that you should give from the choicest and the best. Vi in Shulchan Aruch, and this is actually where it's quoted in Shulchan Aruch, wo der din shebe Rambam vet netak in Hilchos Tzedakah. This halacha that the Rambam says here is actually quoted in Shulchan Aruch in the halachas of Tzedakah. So the Rambam also should have brought this in Hilchos Matnas Aniyim and not wait until here in the end of Hilchos Yisurim Mizbeach. Other, or perhaps noch früher. The Ram can quote this idea even earlier on in Hilchos Tefillah. In the halachas of Hilchos Tefillah, behesim to the erste dugme in Rambam, bana based tefillah chulu, where the Rambam talks about this, that when one builds a base tefillah, a shul, that it should be built nicer than your own home, so that should be brought in Hilchos Tefillah. And Achmer, furthermore, regarding this option, that the Rambam should be bringing it in Hilchos Tefillah, the Rambam bringt in Hilchos Tefillah kamer dinim in oifen binyan beis hakneses. Wie es darf sein, gvoya mikol chatzeres eir chulu. The Rambam there actually mentions certain details about building a shul, regarding the fact that it should be the tallest of all other houses in the city. Weil doch dorten gepasst, zu bringen as hareitze lezakes atzmai, soll bayen a beis Tefillah, so there would be the appropriate place to also mention that one that wants to refine himself should build a shul, that it should be more beautiful than his own home. And then the Rambam can bring other examples that are all included in this general obligation to give the best for the sake of Hashem. That would be a good place where the Rambam should bring it in Hilchos Tefillah much earlier on, not to wait until Hilchos Isurei Mizbeach. Euch darf man verstehen, die Dugmois, welche der Rambam bringt, auf Kol Dovashu l'shem Akel HaTov sheyeh manano v'hatov. What are the examples that the Rambam here brings for this idea, that you should give for Hashem the best? So what are the examples that Rambam brings? Bana based tefillah chulu, building a shul, hechel rav kisa aram chulu, regarding giving for the poor, and hektish davar chulu, and one is makdish, anything for hektish. So the question here is, why is the Rambam bringing these examples for this idea of giving the best for Hashem? The Gemara sagt, den chiyuv von esna lefanav mitzvahs. The Gemara tells us about the obligation to beautify oneself in front of Hashem with mitzvahs. Was wird abgelernt from pasuk ze keli vanveyu, and this is learned out from the pasuk that says, "This is my God, and I will beautify myself in front of Him with mitzvahs." Bringt die Dugmais. And the examples that the Gemara brings for this is a seilafon of sukkah noah, build a beautiful sukkah, the lulav noah, a beautiful lulav, shayfer noah, a nice shayfer, tzitzis noah, a nice tzitzis, and sefer Torah noah, chulu, a nice sefer Torah, which means bidyoy noah, with good quality of ink, bekulmis noah, with a good quill, belavler umon, with a professional scribe that can write beautiful, and v'koychay b'shiroy noah, and you wrap it in a beautiful mantle. That's the examples that the Gemara brings for this idea to give the choicest and the best quality for the sake of a mitzvah for Hashem. Favos bringt der Rambam da andere Dugmois. So why does the Rambam here bring other examples for this? And these examples that the Gemara brings are not exactly quoted anywhere in the Rambam. Okay, so the Rabbi here will now give us a fresh and new understanding in what this last halacha in the Rambam here is. And we can see this from the fact that the Rambam brings it specifically here in the end of Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach, and also the specific choice of the examples that the Rambam brings for this. So we can say that the explanation is as follows, with the following introduction. When we would learn this halacha here at first glance, it would seem to be as follows. As the chiluk zwischen dem Din in Rambam besoif Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach und der halacha von Mivchan Nedrechem, was the Rambam read früher, what is really the distinction, the defining difference between the halacha that the Rambam brings here in the end of Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach regarding this highest level of quality of bringing the best, and the halacha of Mivchan Nedrechem when he talks about the more basic level of bringing the best that was mentioned earlier? Bastet in them consists of the following. Was Mivchan Nedrechem is a din in the Chefze Nedrechem. This is the halacha of Mivchan Nedrechem applies to the actual object, to the actual carbon that's being brought. Das is negayat zum guf kedushas carbon. This is relevant for the actual carbon and its holiness, the actual holiness of the animal itself and its quality that's being brought for a carbon. Und der Rebbe taught them that sein kem prisus, because this is a carbon and it's something that's holy for the sake of Hashem, so therefore there may not be any inferior quality to this. Afilu nitten der mare kochush v'kor, not even in its appearance, that it should be weak and not good looking. Val derech vi b'zoyin kotchem. This is similar to the concept that one may not degrade anything that is a carbon or anything that's from kotchem. So the halacha of Mivchan Nedrechem means that the quality of the object, of the animal that's being brought as a carbon, has to be the best. So it should not be degrading for hektish. That's the meaning, that's the understanding of the halacha of Mivchan Nedrechem regarding the more basic requirement of bringing the best. By contrast, when it comes to the halacha that we're dealing with here at the end of Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach, which is Yavi Karbonai Min HaYofe HaMeshubach BeYoser, that one should bring from the very best that he has for a carbon, is nit came din in the chefza from carbon. This halacha is not a result of the fact that because this is an object of a carbon, there's a basic requirement of what its quality should be. That's not what it's about. Nor rather, sizadin in dem gavre. This is all a halacha that pertains to the person that's donating this carbon. Kidiyek Lashon Rambam, as it seems and it's clear from the words that the Rambam says, Haraitze lezakais atzmai yachoiv yitzroi hara. One that wants to refine himself, subdue his yetzer hara by donating the very best. Which means that this is not something that's required and necessary because of the very object of the carbon and its kedusha that it has. Rather, it's all as a result of the person that wants to refine himself. Und defar is das euch nit kein din prati by karbonis. And this is the reason why this is not a specific halacha regarding only karbonis. It's a general halacha regarding anything that the person is interested in donating for the sake of Hashem, including any other mitzvahs. This is something that the person is doing something special and beautifying in his act by donating this quality. And it's all about what the person is interested in doing for himself to refine and elevate himself. And therefore, whatever it is that he does for the sake of Hashem should be done with the best and the nicest. This is the defining difference, it would seem, between the halacha and that before regarding Mivchan Nedrechem, regarding the cheftze, the actual carbon itself, and then the halacha here and the end of Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach, which pertains to the person that wants to do anything for Hashem's sake. Now, so but we can say, as das bavon der Rambam der mit was learned up dem din von menachos. Here the Rambam comes and clarifies to us by the fact that he learns out the halacha that he says here about giving the very best. And where does he learn this? From the menachos, from the oil, the quality of oil that's chosen for the mincha. Then the Rambam says, if you can bring any quality of oil, why are we counting all the levels of the oil? And additionally, he brings the proof that we find by Hevel that he brought a carbon. Why is the Rambam bringing these proofs? The mid bringt arois. With this, the Rambam is expressing as der yavi karbonim and ayafa meshubach beyaser that one brings a carbon from the very best and the very most qualified is verbunden mit together from karbonis menachis. This is something which is connected to the fact that we're dealing with specifically a carbon. Because it's a carbon, it requires to be from the very best. Versus negeya nit nor in Maisa Gavra, and therefore this is important, not only because of the act that the person is doing in order to refine and elevate himself, nor oich in the chefta shel carbon. This is something which also is necessary or is affecting also the very object of the carbon itself. That's the reason for this additional halacha of one that wants to give the very best. So even though it would seem that this halacha here has nothing to do with the chefta of the carbon itself, but the Rambam brings these proofs specifically in order that it should be clear that this is something which is about and it pertains to the chefta of the carbon itself. Und das is mudgish in the Raya, and this is highlighted in the proof that the Rambam brings that Hareinema b'Torah v'Hevel hevi gam hu mibchayres seinim b'chalbein v'yisha Hashem al Hevel vel mechasei. When Hevel brought the very best of his sheep, and Hashem turned to Hevel and to his carbon mincha. What do we see here in the way that Rambam quotes this? The Rambam is nicht mistapet mit die Werte v'Hevel hevi gam hu mibchayres seinim b'chalbein. The Rambam does not just stop by this that Hevel brought from the very best. He brings the continuation of the pasuk where it says about what happened as a result. He doesn't just bring the fact that Hashem turned towards him. The Rambam concludes and says, El Hevel ve'el minchasai. Hashem turned to Hevel and to the mincha. Why does the Rambam bring all of this? Well, the mit is a madgish. With this, the Rambam wants to emphasize as the avos hakarbon minayofe hamishubach beyaser. When one brings a carbon from the very best quality, is nit blois an inyan b'shaychus lamaisa hagavra. This is not only something which is an expression of the act that the person is doing when he wants to refine himself. This is something which is relevant for the quality of the carbon itself, for the chefza of the carbon itself. Der Vayisha Hashem, and as we see this in the pasuk here, because the pasuk says Hashem turns is given nitnar el hevel mitzad zayin yochef yitzrei. It's not only that Hashem turns to him and accepts what he did on a personal level, that he subdued his Yetzer Hara by giving his very best. Nor oich al tzabazundir inyan ve'el min chasei. The pasuk says, and it adds that word ve'el, and Hashem also turned to the mincha, that the mincha itself is from the best quality, and therefore Hashem turns and accepts this carbon on a different level. That's what the Rambam is clarifying by bringing this pasuk and the way he quotes the proof from Hevel. So the question though is, why is this? When it comes to the fact that it shouldn't be from an inferior quality, so we understand that there's a concept of not degrading kotchim, and therefore it has to be from a basic, good, at least average quality, or a better than average. But the fact that it has to be from the very best, why is that a qualification necessary for a carbon specifically? We understand that this would be something that the person wants to subdue his Yetzer Hara and refine himself, so he chooses from his very best and he's ready to give it up for the sake of Hashem. But why is this something which is relevant for the actual chefza, for the quality of the carbon itself? The Hasbara Bezeh, so the explanation for this is the chiluk tzevischen kiyuma mitzvahs und inyan karbonis bechlolus b'yachas lahachefza. What is the difference between all mitzvahs and karbanis, which is also a mitzvah, but karbanis though stand out in a category for themselves that are different than all other mitzvahs, when we look at the importance of the chefza, the object that's being used in a mitzvah, and the object in the carbon. Kiyama mitzvahs, when it comes to all mitzvahs, is ikroi ma'isa shel gavra. The main point of the mitzvah is the act that the person is doing. The gavra is mekayim tzivei Hashem she'olav. The person is fulfilling the command of Hashem that lies upon him. Now, the kiyum v'adurch gefiert durch the the obligation and the fulfillment of the mitzvah is through the object that he's doing the mitzvah with. As in Faran kamedargis and the pa'ula was vert oivgetan in the chefza, and there are different levels of what kind of effect the mitzvah will have in the object that's being used for the mitzvah. Tashmisha mitzvah, those things that are being used for the sake of a mitzvah, or tashmisha kedusha, things that are being used for kedusha, which is even a level more. There's those things that are used for all mitzvahs, and there are things that are used for the sake of a sefer Torah, for tefillin, and so on, which are tashmisha kedusha. There are different levels. To what degree the object used in a mitzvah has to be preserved and treated properly. However, the effect on the object and the level of kedusha that it has is not the point and is not the purpose of the act of the mitzvah that the person does. Zayin inyan is that kiyum a mitzvah shaloi. The point of the person that does this mitzvah is to fulfill his mitzvah. Nor al yidei pa'ulas hagavre vert oivgetan in the chefze. When one does the mitzvah with the object, there's also an outcome that will be in the object itself, as mentioned, tashmisha mitzvah, tashmisha kedusha, v'chulu, but that's not the main point of a mitzvah. The point of the mitzvah is the gavra, the person that's fulfilling his obligation in this mitzvah. Big karbonis aber, however, when it comes to karbonis, is the gedra mitzvah, the kedusha, the hakar ben gufa. What is the defining factor of this mitzvah of karbonis? It's the holiness that there is in the very carbon itself. Das heißt, das was is makdish und git die Sache weg la Hashem. The whole point of the mitzvah is about the object, about the animal that he sanctifies and then gives and dedicates and sacrifices for Hashem. Says dabei euch da sein kiyama mitzvah. When one brings a carbon, there's also the person that's fulfilling the mitzvah that lies upon him. And as the mitmekayim, the neder, was out of sich genommen of bringen a carbon, he fulfills a vow that he took upon himself to bring this carbon or anything similar. Other that is mekayim mitzvasai, to bring them bestimmten carbon, was is mechuyev, or he fulfills an obligation that he has for any carbon that he's obligated to bring. Das ist aber der Iker, da ist aber der Iker, nit der kiyama mitzvah shel hagavra. However, by a carbon, the main point is not the fact that the person is fulfilling his obligation. No, be'ikir, the pu'ula in the chefze. The point of a carbon is the result that happens with the object, with the carbon itself, with the animal. Der makriv zayin a carbon l'Hashem, a vegev the behem v'chulu l'Hashem. The fact that that animal that you own is being dedicated and given away and sacrificed in the mizbeach for Hashem. Was the Seder bezeh is, and the order of this is, as frier is the mensch makdish to behema, the person has to sanctify this animal for a carbon. Danach brengt the zile beis hamikdash chulu, then it's brought to the beis hamikdash. Bizmi zi makriv b'shlichus bala carbon al gavi hamizbech, and then the ultimate point is that the kayanim being the agents of the yidden to bring karbanis, the shliach, and they bring it on the mizbeach. That's the ultimate point of what the carbon is. So here the effect in the chefze is not just an outcome of the fulfillment of the mitzvah that the person is doing, that's actually the whole objective, that the carbon should be brought on the mizbeach and sacrificed for Hashem. Ubesignen pashut yaiseh, to say this in simpler words, alle mitzvahs, all other mitzvahs, afil la'achre v'dechefetz mit welchem is mekayim the mitzvah, ver tashmisha mitzvah v'chayetze b'zeh. All other mitzvahs, even after you fulfill the mitzvah, so then it becomes something which was used for a mitzvah, bleibt das bebalusa shel adam. But the ownership status does not change. It's still owned by the person. Die Sach, was Yid git weg la Hashem. What is something that a person gives up his ownership and gives it away to Hashem, when the Rebbe nimmt das von him and Hashem takes it from him, is bakrovas carbon. That's when one brings the carbon. So here we can clearly see that the effect on the chefza, on the object, on the animal that's brought on by a carbon is on a completely different level. The very ownership of the object is being given away and given up for Hashem's sake. That's the introduction there to understand what's unique about a carbon that's different than all mitzvahs. Und das ist der Chiluk zwischen der Din, Hider Mitzvah. Was die Gemara lernt ab vom Pasuk, Zekelu Vaveyu, und die Din, und dem Din in der Rambam, Yavi Karbonei, Menayafe, Hamishubach B'Yosef. This explains the difference between the halacha of beautifying a mitzvah that the Gemara speaks about, and the Gemara learns it from the pasuk Zekeli Vanveyu, and the Gemara brings examples of mitzvahs for this, and the halacha of the Rambam when he speaks about bringing from the very best for the karbanis, and the Rambam brings other sources and other examples for this. They're not talking about the same thing. Der din hider mitzvah is wie the mitzvah gufe nita zoytze lieb de chefze. When it comes to beautifying a mitzvah, just like the mitzvah itself, which is about the person fulfilling his obligation, so too regarding the beautification of the mitzvah, it's not so much focused on the object itself of the mitzvah. Nor tzolib kiyama mitzvah shalagavra. It's all about the level of fulfillment of the mitzvah, that how the person is doing this. And as the Gemara puts it, hisnoa lefana v'mitzvahs, that you beautify yourself in front of Hashem with the mitzvahs you do. As the mitzvah was the Adam is mekayim is ve'anveyu, the mitzvahs that a person does is in a way of beautifying himself with these mitzvahs. So v'meila asay lefanav sukkana lulavna v'cholu, and therefore you have the beautiful sukkah and the beautiful lulav, but it's not about the object itself. The point there is not about that there's something about a mitzvah that the object of the mitzvah requires these beautifications. It's about the person doing the mitzvah in the most beautiful way. Mit dem was the ma'aser mit welcher tut die mitzvah is not, by the fact that the act of with what he's doing the mitzvah is beautiful, is the key mitzvah shel hagavre and an eifem fun is not lefonav far the meibishten. So now the fulfillment of the mitzvah of the person doing this is very beautiful in front of Hashem. That's by all mitzvahs. By karbonis aber, however, by contrast, when it comes to karbonis, is das bringing karbonis menayofe hameshubich b'yaise, bringing from the best quality for a carbon. Nit blois tzalib dem hisna lefanav. Here, the point of the best is not just for the person to do his act of a mitzvah in the most beautiful way, from dem gavra, nor fakert. Here it's the opposite. Das is a chelek uprat von dem geder a carbon la Hashem. Here this is all a detail in how we define the whole concept of a carbon, where it's about the object, about the animal that's not going to be sacrificed and be taken by Hashem. As der carbon la Hashem was besteht in der kedusha va'akrava la Hashem, a vegeben la Hashem. When it comes to a carbon, where the whole point of the carbon, the whole objective of the carbon is that it's going to be sacrificed and given away, dedicated to Hashem, is b'shleimus u'b'hidei yaiseh, that the object of that animal should be the best quality, so now the best will be given for the sake of Hashem, the most beautiful. So it is here about the very object of the animal itself in the fulfillment of karbonis. That's what's unique about the halacha, the way that Rambam is quoting this here, and is telling us this halacha specifically here in Hilchas Isurim Mizbeach, as the Rebbe will explain now. And this is the time, so this is the reason for what the Rambam bring them din erst in Hilchas Isurim Mizbeach. The Rambam quotes this halacha here specifically in Hilchas Isurim Mizbeach, and not anywhere earlier in Hilchas Tefillah or in Hilchas Matan Saniyim, where he's discussing other mitzvahs or tzedakah. Val der inyan is negayat zum geder from Mizbeach, because this concept about the best carbon is actually something that's relevant here, and regarding a carbon which is to be brought in the Mizbeach, and the way the mitzvah of a carbon is, and it's the way it's defined, that's what requires, or that's the basis of this halacha that the Rambam says, this highest level of best quality. Noch mehr, es ist negeit zu Hilchas Isurim Mizbeach, noch mehr wie afillet zu Hilchas Maisar Karbanis. This is something that's relevant, and the Rambam brings it specifically here in the halachas of Mizbeach, even more than the other halachas, where the Rambam discusses many details about Maisar Karbanis, the details of what one does in bringing a carbon. But the Rambam does not bring this halacha there, he brings it specifically in the halachas of Mizbeach. The reason is that Iker from Inyan carbon is carbon Lashem. What's the main thing of a carbon? The fact that this is a carbon for Hashem's sake. Although the activity that a person does in bringing the carbon to be brought to Hashem begins from the point where he dedicates the animal for Hashem, is aber der Iker und Gemara carbon ba'akravosai al gabi ha-mizbeach. The main objective and the main point of the carbon is when it's sacrificed on the Mizbeach. Was demel b'shasavert lachmai shel mizbeach. Then, when it becomes the bread of the mizbeach, as it says this expression in the Gemara, says da achilas mizbeach, it gets consumed on the mizbeach and the fire. Verter a Chelek from Shulchan Gavoya. Now it becomes a portion of the food on the table of Hashem. That's the ultimate point of the carbon. Und der Rebbe, so therefore, is der inyan von yarchiv yodai v'yavi karbonai menayafa meshubach b'yaser, that one should be generous and bring from the very best for the carbon. Was bringt reis die shleimus von esine la Hashem, by a carbon that expresses the most best giving to Hashem, when you're giving away as a carbon, is negeya nita zaitzu the etzem geder from mukdashim or the ma'asar karbonis. This point is not relevant as much for the very fact that we're talking about something which is kachim, or the details of the actions that are done and all the steps in the process of bringing a carbon. Was in them ver nichlal ala pratim from the ma'asar carbon. That includes many different details about what is done with the carbon. And not necessarily this ultimate point here of bringing and sacrificing it on the Mizbeach, which is the ultimate dedication for Hashem. Nor to Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach. This point here about bringing the best, where does the Rambam quote this? Specifically here in Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach, which is the Gemar, Ushleimus, Kedushas HaKarbon, but this is Babasa Gabe Mizbeach. This is the completion of the full dedication of the carbon being sanctified on the Mizbeach. That's why the Rambam here quotes this halacha about bringing the very best So it should be clear that the halacha that we're talking about is not about anything that pertains to the gavra, about the person trying to beautify himself in front of Hashem like other mitzvahs, but rather by bringing it on the Mizbeach, that is the whole point, that it should be a full dedication to Hashem with the best carbon that's being dedicated. Now, based on this, the Rebbe will explain the examples that the Rambam brings, that this applies not only by a carbon, but in other cases as well. And the Rambam chooses specifically these examples that have a similar idea to the way it is by karbanis, and the Rambam does not bring the examples from the Gemara. With this we can answer and explain, was the Rambam zogdi the Gmois von Bana based Filo v'chulu. He brings the examples of building a shul, and the other examples, as the Rebbe will explain, as bazei is the zelbe din from yiem and anoa toiv, that there as well we apply this halacha that it should be from the very best, unit the dugmois b'shas, and the Rambam does not bring the examples from the Gemara. And the reason is, as explained, do retzich nid wegen dem geder von hidden mitzvah. Here, the Rambam is not talking about the concept of beautifying a mitzvah. A hidden in dem zach was mitut in mitzvah, when one beautifies something that he does in a mitzvah, nor rather what we're talking about here, kol dava shul l'shem akel atoif. We're talking about something that's going to be dedicated for the sake of Hashem. Jede zach was is gleich zu carbon al gabe mizbeach. And we're talking about other cases that are similar to a carbon that's sacrificed and brought and dedicated to Hashem on the Mizbeach. In them was migites l'shem akel atoif. And therefore the Rambam brings examples of cases when one is dedicating something for Hashem's name. So what are the examples that the Rambam brings? The first example is bana based tefillah for the Meibishim, when you build a shul for the sake of Hashem. So that's not just doing a mitzvah, an act of a mitzvah, but building a house of davening for Hashem. And the last example that Rambam brings, when one sanctifies, dedicates anything for Hashem, is toichnoi v'sargites l'shem akel. The content of what's happening here is not just an act of a mitzvah, that a person is doing the obligation of a mitzvah, but rather dedicating something for Hashem's sake. Now, those are examples that are similar to a carbon. And similar could also be explained, the two cases in the middle that the Rambam brings about one that gives for the poor, whether he gives them food or clothing. So even though it may seem like just an act of tzedakah, a mitzvah, similar to the other category of the hidur of mitzvahs in general, but when the Rambam brings this here, the Rambam has a specific intention with this. And that is as follows. The Rogachover is mevayer, as in tzedakah, zenefaran, svei gedorim. The Rogachover explains regarding tzedakah, that in tzedakah there are two different categories, two different aspects to tzedakah. Tzedakah, they have a geder mitzvah. There's the aspect of tzedakah, which is a mitzvah, like all other mitzvahs. In this case, a mitzvah ben adam lachavere, to give for the poor. On tzedakah, begeder kapara. And then there's tzedakah that one gives for the sake of an atonement. Und das is the Hadgashe in the Rambam, Hechel Rav Kisa Aram. This is what the Rambam is highlighting when he uses these examples of giving to eat for the poor and giving them clothing. He doesn't give just a general example of giving money for tzedakah. It's these examples of tzedakah that's connected to the fact that tzedakah is as an atonement. And as we see this in the pasuk where it says, Preis l'rav lachmecha, cut a piece of bread for the poor, and bring the poor into a home, and you see a poor man, give him clothing to cover himself. This is a pasuk where the Navi is saying what has to be done on a day of a fast, for tshuva and kapara al derech karbanis, similar to karbanis. And therefore this example as well, the Rambam is bringing here, that when you have tzedakah that's for the sake of a kapara, like a carbon, and also building a shul and being makdish anything for the Beis HaMikdash, these are similar to karbanis, where the point there is not the act of the mitzvah that the gavra is doing, but the main thing is the dedication to Hashem. And this mitzvah, that's where the point is, that one should give for the very best, from this very best, to be dedicated for the sake of Hashem. That's the point of this halacha in the Rambam here, brought specifically in Hilchis Isurei Mizbeach. Okay, now here the Rebbe will go on to explain how this is understood with the words that the Rambam says here, that Haroitze, as the Rebbe was medayik in the beginning, that it would seem that this is talking about the Gavra, the person that wants to dedicate and purify himself. As the Rambam says, Haroitze, Lezaka is Atzmoi, Yochiv, Yitzrei, Harav, Yarchiv, Yodai, that this is about one that wants to purify himself and so on. So how does that expression of the Rambam connect to the point that the Rebbe made here, that we're talking specifically about the concept of karbanis, dedicating a carbon for the Mizbeach that's being sacrificed and being given away to Hashem? So the Rabbi explains, the Asbar, as a shaykhis von die zwei Yinyanim in dem din von Yavi Karbonoi, Menayafe HaMeshubach B'Yaser, to explain the connection of the 2 points that we see here in the language of the Rambam regarding bringing the very best for a carbon. Aleph, number 1, Als Din in Yisurim Mizbeach. The Rambam specifically quotes it here in the halachas of a Mizbeach, was es verbunden mit der Chefze der Carbon va Kravase Agabe Mizbeach. And this is specifically by the object of a carbon that's being dedicated and sacrificed on a Mizbeach. But then the other point that we see in the words of the Rambam, the Maisa Gavra, that the person that wants to purify himself, that he should give in the most generous way and give from the very best. So what's the connection of these 2 points? Seemingly, we're not focusing here on the act of the Gavra. So the point is the Gemar v'Shleimus, Kedushas HaKarban LaHashem. What is the ultimate level of the Kedusha of the carbon for Hashem? Which is when it's sacrificed in the Mizbeach, is das Gufe di Sibbe of the Ritzui und the Kaparas HaAdam was a carbon turtoif. When it's a pure and total and full dedication on the Mizbeach from the very best, this itself is the reason for how this carbon brings the person the greatest and best kapara and atonement through the carbon that he brings. So these 2 things go together. Because through bringing the very best carbon, when one dedicates for Hashem, and that's the main focus of the halacha here, to bring from the very best for the chefts of the carbon that you're dedicating to Hashem, it's this itself that brings the full kapara for the person. On the Ribber, so therefore the Rambam connects the 2 and says, Vas merses da de Yochav Yitzra Ra, v'yarchiv Yoda v'yavi karbonim and Ayafa HaMeshubach B'Yoseh. The more a person subdues his Yetzer Hara and gives generously from the very best, is the Nesinis HaGavra LaHashem. And so, in the Nesinis HaGavra LaHashem, in his dedication for what he gives to Hashem, Alzmer is the Smeisif and the Shleimus HaKapara v'Ritzah Shel HaGavra. The more it will add to the completion and the full appeasement that there is in the carbon that the person is bringing. Was the Mizbeach Payel, which the Mizbeach accomplishes. L'Zakai Satzmai, and that is to purify oneself. So therefore these 2 points go together. That the better level of dedication that there is to Hashem, in the hiddur of the chefts of the carbon, that it should be the best dedication to Hashem, that itself is a cause for a higher level of kapara. Now you may ask, well, a kapara is a kapara. You bring a carbon and it's accepted, it's kosher, it's okay. So it's a kapara either way. So the Rebbe says, no, there's different levels of kapara. This is similar to what we find, that there are various different levels to the kapara of the person based on the person's intentions. Kippur v'lei kippur, there's an expression the Gemara says when there's an atonement that's incomplete. Then chilek tzvishen ritzui achatos and ritzui de'oila. The Gemara discusses the difference between the kapara that's accomplished through a carbon chatos or an oila and the oid, and the different additional levels of kapara that there may be. And that's also the point here, that the more the better, and the more b'shleimus the chefts of the carbon is in its dedication to Hashem, the more kapara there will be for the person. And that's where the Rambam connects this to haroitze l'zakis atzmai, when one wants to purify himself. This idea will be understood even better. Based on what Mefarshim explain, and especially the Ramban al Atayre explains the reason for the concept of bringing a carbon. The Ramban is mevayer, then tam was carbon is an mechaper. The Ramban explains the reason why bringing a animal as a carbon brings an atonement to the person. That a person should think to himself when he does everything for a carbon, that he sinned for Hashem, with his body and his soul, and therefore what's being done here to the animal, it would be deserving that it should be done to himself. If not for the kindness of Hashem, that he takes the carbon instead of him. Dame dar carbon, tachas dame, nefesh tachas nefesh, the blood of the carbon instead of his own blood, the life of the animal instead of his own life. That's what a person should be thinking about. That's the point of a carbon. So based on this we can understand, since this is the case, is moving, it's understood as the Yachov, Yitzrei Hara, that a person subdues his Yetzer Hara in what he dedicates for a carbon is nit a Zayte Gezach, was in der Akrovas carbon al Gabe Mizbeach. It's not a side point that while you're bringing a carbon, you could also choose to bring from your very best. You're giving up the very best of what you have and you subdue your Yetzer Hara. That's not a side point. Other al Kapanim, Nacha Prat and the Minyan carbon are just one detail about the carbon. No, das is the ganze Gedera carbon. This is actually the whole definition of what the carbon is about, which is Yachayv Yitzrei Hara, to subdue one's Yetzer Hara, was in dem besteht dem Ritzoi und the Kapara von dem carbon. This itself is the whole point of the atonement of the carbon, that one should see what's happening here in the carbon and imagine that this should be happening to himself, that he should be subdued in this way. And therefore, when one gives from his very best, giving up from his very best and subduing his Yetzer Hara, that's the actual fulfillment of what a carbon is about. Based on this, the Rebbe comes to explain another detail about this. From where are we learning out all of this? It's not only brought in Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach in general, but it's brought specifically being learned out from the qualities of the oil being used for the flour offering, for the carbon mincha. Al Pizeh Yesh Levayer, based on this we could explain. Hatam was the din from Yachiv Yitzrei, v'yavi karbanim and ayafa ameshubach b'yaser. Why this idea of one subduing his Yetzer Hara and bringing from the very best? Werd abgelernt from the shmanim lemenachis dafke. It's learned specifically from the qualities of oil that are brought for the carbon mincha. The teichen in Inyan karbanis is, what's the content of a carbon? Was ayid gitzech avek to the meibishn. Ayid gives himself away, he dedicates himself to Hashem. Duruch koife Yitzrei Hara v'chulu, by subduing his Yetzer Hara and so on. Aber when is das ba'amitis u'b'shleimus? When is a person truly and genuinely dedicating himself completely to Hashem? B'shas seiner weggeben sich is in ganzen zu dem Eibischen belichish beines. This is when one dedicates himself without having any calculations involved in this. Und daf gedemelt is das meratze und mechaper a kapara shleimo gemura. And it's only then that you have the full and complete kapara in this. Und das ist echt der Tam, was man lernt es ab von die Shmanim lemenachis dafke. This is the reason why this is learned out. This concept of giving away the very best is learned from the oil of the carbon mincha. Al derech maimer azal, because this is understood based on what Chazal tell us, as dafke by carbon mincha steht, v'nefesh kisakrev. Only by the carbon mincha does the Torah use the expression a soul that will bring a carbon. Because Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem says, Mi darkoi lohavi mincha. Who's the one that usually brings a mincha? Ani, a poor individual that can't bring a nice fat animal. And he brings from the little flour that he has and he dedicates it to Hashem. Mailani olav ki ilu hikriv nafshay lefanai. I will consider it as if he brings his very soul to be dedicated to me. And this is dafke by carbon mincha, specifically by the carbon mincha for the poor individual that has nothing, and the little that he has, he gives it away to Hashem, meaning he's making no calculations. He doesn't bring a nice big fat ox, nor dali dalos von a carbon. He brings the very lowest quality of a carbon. Is da merbad goshe v'hikriv nafshe lefanai. But what's being highlighted here in this act is that he's really dedicating his soul to Hashem. Varamayim is nitok in hergish as is makriv a carbon behidur b'shleimus. Since he's not bringing this nice big fat carbon, he doesn't have that feeling that it's me that's bringing this beautiful carbon for Hashem. Is Hashem yid. He is this nice high quality Jew, was bringing a carbon that's bringing a carbon to Hashem behidur with such beauty, doesn't have that feeling. By im hetzech the emese shivrin alev. On the contrary, he senses this bringing the carbon with that he has a broken heart here. Kfiyas hayetzer, subduing his Yetzer Hara, bis zu zvichas hayetzer, furthermore slaughtering his Yetzer Hara. Und the far is ki'ilu hikriv nafshay, and therefore it's as if he has brought his very soul to Hashem. And therefore, when the Rambam wants to learn out this concept of bringing the choicest and the best to dedicate completely to Hashem, to bring the full kapara, he learns it out from the carbon mincha, where you have the full dedication to Hashem. Through dedicating oneself to Hashem on this level, by subduing the Yetzer Hara and bringing from the very best. This is the conclusion and the end of all the halachas of the Yisurim Mizbeach, As la'achre hascholas ha'polis from the mizbeach kaparas nafshe. After you start the beginning of what the mizbeach is to accomplish, the atonement for the person. Kaparas ha'oster, oster v'kosher. When you need a kapara for something that was done that was completely forbidden. Starting at the bottom. Vet nimshach un aufgetan die pe'ola from mizbeach b'shleimusa. So you continue and you come to the conclusion of Hilchas Yisur mizbeach when you have the complete and highest level of kapara, v'nirtzalei lechaper olav, that is completely appeased and it comes to Hashem totally clean on the highest level, lechaper lefnei avaya lasas nachas ruach lekainai, that there's a complete atonement with a pleasure for Hashem. Kamay merazal, as the Gemara tells us about what the mizbeach is, that the word mizbeach makes up the following words. Mizbeach is maziach, which means maziach gzeiris ra'is mal Yisrael. It removes the decrees from Yidden. Umezin ha'olam nizayin, it brings the food and sustenance for the world. And mechavev, this is the ultimate thing of the mizbeach, mechavev es Yisrael alaviyim, it brings the love between the Yidden and their Father in heaven, and mechaper avaynis, it atones their sins on the highest level. When one dedicates himself to Hashem on this level, and you take away the cause and the reason for destruction and exile, aveinis chataenu, which is the averis, ved gleich umemele batel de mesuviv, so immediately and automatically the outcome is also nullified. Der galinu ma'artzenu, the fact that we are exiled from our land, un miyad hein negolan al yedei Mashiach tzidkenu, we're immediately redeemed through Mashiach. Was yivne mikdash b'mkaimai u b'myuchad ha-mizbeach, was mekaimai mechuvim b'yased, that will build a base of mikdash, and specifically the mizbeach, that it has to be in a very, very specific place. V'yikabeitz nitche Yisrael, and will gather all Yidden all over the world b'meheira v'yameinu mamish.